I'm going to provide short talks on issues related to Zionism. This talk addresses the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. This definition is completely bogus, and it boggles the mind that any country has adopted it. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. This is a bogus definition. Consider that we could replace anti-Semitism by anti-French nobles, and it would apply. Many people before the French Revolution were extremely angry at the French nobility. So let's continue with the bogus definition of anti-Semitism. The following examples may serve as illustrations. Manifestations might include the targeting of the State of Israel, conceived as a Jewish collectivity. My comment: Israel conceives of itself as a Jewish collectivity. It calls itself the Jewish state and tells us that it is the homeland of all the Jews. Continuing. However, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitism. Excuse me? The State of Israel was founded by genocide. After the Nuremberg Tribunal in 1946 made acts of genocide international crimes in international made acts of genocide crimes in international law, capital crimes in international law. The State of Israel differs from every other state which has genocide in its history because its existence vitiates the international anti-genocide legal regime. The world can either have a State of Israel or it can have an international anti-genocide legal regime. It cannot have both. In many regards, the State of Israel opposing the abolition of the State of Israel is more evil today than opposing the abolition of U.S. slavery was before the Civil War. Before the ratification of the 13th Amendment, slavery was not illegal in the United States. After 1946, an act of genocide became a capital international crime in international law. There is no equivalent state that's like Israel in terms of its original sin. Israel has to be abolished, and its very existence undermines international law. So let's continue with the moronic definition. Anti-Semitism frequently charges Jews with conspiring to harm humanity, and it is often used to blame Jews for why things go wrong. It is expressed in speech, writing, visual forms, and action, and employs sinister stereotypes and negative character traits. Ben-Gurion and Ben-Zvi, leaders of the Zionist movement, admitted that the Palestinian peasantry descended from ancient Judeans. Palestinian society provided a unique window onto culture and society in the Roman Empire at one of the most critical periods in the human race, that at the beginning of Augustus and at the beginning of the mission of Jesus, when the empire was reorganizing itself in a new way and making um, the economic system rational throughout the Mediterranean. We still follow principles of the Roman Empire in governance and in law. The Zionist movement wanted to eradicate Palestinian culture and to a large extent has done it in pre-1967 Israel and replace it with a artificial Zionist fake Jewish culture, or actually it's fake Zionist culture, and wiped out a treasure trove of information that belonged to human scholarship. So let's continue. Contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, the media, schools, the workplace, and in the religious sphere could, taking into account the overall context, include, but are not limited to, calling for aiding or justifying the killing or harming of Jews in the name of a radical ideology or an extremist view of religion. Well, I have to comment. We considered the resistance of the natives in occupied Europe against the Nazis to be heroic. Likewise, resistance of the natives of Palestine to genocidal Zionist invaders has to be considered heroic. The Nuremberg Tribunal refused to consider the active defense when Nazis murdered natives in occupied Europe because the Nazis claimed that they were conducting acts of terrorism. The Nuremberg Tribunal reasonably decided or concluded that acts of resistance to the Nazis cannot be considered terrorism. Likewise, in stolen Palestine, acts of resistance to Zionists cannot be considered terrorism. So let's continue. Making mendacious, dehumanizing, demonizing, or stereotypical allegations about Jews as such, or the power of Jews as collective, such as, especially but not exclusively, the myth about a world Jewish conspiracy or of Jews controlling the media, economy, government, or other societal institutions. How many justices on the Supreme Court are Jewish? How many are Protestant or Catholic? What is the percentage of Jews in the United States? There is a certain disproportionality in the role that Jews play in American culture, politics, and society. In fact, commentary in an article by Gabriel Schoenfeld complained that Democrats were going to unite with American Muslims to build the majority and ignore Jewish interests. Respect that in case of commentary, that means Zionist interests. Well, that's what it means to have a democracy. The majority determines policy in the government. Commentary is explicitly anti-democratic and believes that Jews, specifically Zionists, should have power in the United States way out of the proportion to their size within the American population. The definition continues. Accusing Jews as a people of being responsible for real or imagined wrongdoing committed by a single Jewish person or group, or even for acts committed by non-Jews. Well, I don't really see very much of that. Denying the fact, scope, mechanisms, for example, gas chambers or intentionality of the genocide of the Jewish people at the hands of National Socialist Germany and its supporters and accomplices during World War II. specifically the Holocaust. I have to comment, while the Germans obviously intended genocide of Jews since they took power in 1933, in Eastern Europe and in territories under control of the German Nazis after the start of Operation Barbarossa, many people were frightened or angry at the obvious and wildly disproportionate role that Jewish Bolsheviks played in the Soviet Union. Their anger and desire for revenge in a form of blowback may not actually have been genocide under the definitions that Raphael Lemkin developed and that were used at Nuremberg and that became part of the International Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. If we need an archetypal genocide, we should actually look at the Nakba, which started in 1948, was planned since the 1880s, and continues to this day. I prefer to call it the holoexolapsis because it's the great erasure, the effort of Zionists to wipe out the native culture of Palestine and, in truth, the native Palestinians, and any element of human scholarship that disagrees with Zionist propaganda. And actually, in fact, the next part of the definition says accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. The narrative of the Holocaust used by Zionists actually has very little connection to what most scholars outside consider the narrative of the Holocaust to be. So I'm not sure what this means. Israel lies about the Holocaust. It's indisputable. Accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or to the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interests of their own nations. What does Haim Saban say? He's one of the largest Democratic contributors to the Democratic Party. He tells us that he's a one-issue type of guy. He only cares about Israel. It seems like this part of the definition flies in the face of the facts. Then the definition from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance continues. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination. That is, by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. Well, if we actually look at the term Jewish people, we find that it is a loan translation from German of das jüdische Volk. It's incorrectly translated into English, or mendaciously translated into English as the Jewish people. We have to look at how the Nazis expressed the Aryan race in German to understand the mendacity of the term the Jewish people. The Nazis in German referred to das arische Volk, the Aryan race. We see that, in fact, the Jewish people is properly translated into English from the original German as the Jewish race. Jews are not a race. They are a religious community. And no modern Jew descends from ancient Judeans. We know this because ancient Greco-Roman historians tell us that the vast majority of the Judaic population of the Roman Empire descended from non-Judean converts to Judaism. And we also have no ancient historian that actually refers to a removal of the Judean population from Judea. No modern Jew descends from ancient Judeans and actually ancient Sumerians. Only Palestinians do. Palestinians are the descendants of ancient Judeans and Sumerians. Zionists committed genocide against Palestinians on the basis of a fairy tale of their descent from the people that are ancestors of Palestinians. It's hard to be more despicable than a Zionist. So let's look further at this clause within the definition of anti-Semitism. Jews are a religious community. Now, we tend to use Jew in an ethnic sense in English and in many European languages. There's a reason for this. While Jews belong to multiple ethnic groups, in a given area, typically Jews only belong to one ethnic group. And the ethnic groups of Jews are not congruent with the ethnic groups of Christians or Muslims. And in fact, there's no reason to expect them to be. The main Jewish ethnic groups consist of Ibero-Berbers, Slavo-Turks, Syro-Mesopotamians, and South Arabians. There is no Christian Ibero-Berber ethnic group. There is no Christian Slavo-Turk ethnic group. The Slavo-Turks were the ones who spoke Yiddish. They are actually my ancestors. And likewise, well, there is more congruence of Jews with Syro-Mesopotamians of Muslim or Christian background. And there's likewise for South Arabians, but there is a difference. When we look at Jewish history, and it's actually fairly well documented. It's actually very well documented because we have responsa that goes back 1,000 years. Jewish communities constituted a metapopulation, which means that there were large, actually vast Jewish trade networks in the pre-modern period, and they often exchanged members from one Jewish region to another, so that actually Jewish Ibero-Berbers would actually acquire a lot of genetic background from Slavo-Turks and vice versa. And so would Syro-Mesopotamians and South Arabians. So Jews might actually look phenotypically different from the local non-Jewish populations, and it would make sense to say that in Eastern Europe there was a Jewish look, or in North Africa there was a Jewish look, or in South Arabia the Jews might actually, having more Slavo-Turk or Ibero-Berber background than the Muslims, would also have a definite Jewish look. But that doesn't mean that they have a right to self-determination in Palestine and take away the right of democratic self-determination from the natives of Palestine. Of course, the state of Israel is a completely racist endeavor. Zionism presupposes that the historical and national rights of Jews, a complete fairy tale, are superior to the human rights and the property rights of the natives. How can you be more explicitly racist? Then the definition continues, applying double standards by requiring of it behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation. Well, the state of Israel is founded by genocide. It routinely strips the natives of property rights, and it abuses them. When we demand that Israel not act like this, we are demanding the state of Israel behave like a decent nation. And in truth, because the State of Israel was founded criminally by white racial supremacist Euro-Zionist invaders in 1948, there's only one legitimate behavior for Israel. That is to abolish itself and turn its leadership over to an international tribunal for trial, just as the Nazis were tried in 1946 at Nuremberg. The only way the international anti-genocide legal regime can be respected is if it's applied uniformly. The law that applies to genocidal Nazis has to apply to genocidal Zionists. Zionists cannot get a pass to commit genocide on the non-Euro natives of Palestine. This is called worthy victim syndrome. We're willing to, or Euro racists are willing to accept a charge of genocide that Europeans bring against Europeans, but are unwilling, because they're still racists, to accept a charge of genocide brought by non-Euros against Euros. I guess it cuts a little bit too close to the history of Europeans in their colonial empires. So the definition continues, using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, for the sake of example, claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis. Well, that's part of politics. You use symbols associated with negatively with groups to attack those groups for the new evil that they're committing. Now, Jews didn't kill Jesus, so that's probably legitimate. Jesus was killed, apparently, according to the stories, by the Romans at the request of the Judean leadership. So we should probably understand that history correctly. But the blood libel is something else. And it may, in some cases, not have been a libel. In the pre-modern period, there was a Jewish trade for the props and the materials used by alchemists. One of those materials was dried blood, especially of virgins. Jews controlled that trade. And how did they actually acquire the dried blood? Well, there was a certain amount, actually a large amount, of predatory lending in the pre-modern period, and most of it was done by Jews. I mean, there are other groups that engaged in predatory lending too. Tuscans and Lombards, Sicilians, Armenians, Greeks. But Jews were very efficient at it. And there are reasons for that which have to do with historical developments. So if you're a loan shark and you have a sweetheart relationship with some trader in materials for alchemy, you could do some predatory lending, and perhaps you could make a deal with the peasant or lower bourgeois person who was in debt and couldn't get out. You might bleed, using leeches, a child to acquire blood from a virgin, which could then be dried and sold at very high rates, to alchemists. Occasionally, the child might die. Well, this really has nothing to do with this has nothing to do with the traditional blood libel, which has to do with ritual associated with Passover. But most of the non-Jewish, the co-resident non-Jews that saw things like this happen didn't really understand the business of Jewish traders. They developed a phenomenology. So some blood libels seem not to have been libels. There's also another aspect to the predatory lending. The predatory lending might actually discharge the loan in exchange for a trial which could be sold on the slave market. In the pre-modern period, and in fact to this day, Jews are disproportionate in human trafficking. And it tied in with predatory lending, still does in fact. And that was and because enslavement was a form of social death, vanishing of a child might be seen as something that's related to the accusation that Jews are killing children. It sounds terrible, but we have to look at the history honestly. And most Jews are not as involved in loan sharking as they were used to be. This type of loan sharking is highly illegal, but they were allowed to do this in the pre-modern period, often in cooperation with the local aristocracy, which got their cut. It's a historical fact. There isn't much you can do about it. And then we have to go on to the next part of the definition or examples that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance provides, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Are Zionists so ethically superior to the rest of us that they could not act like Nazis? Many groups have acted like Nazis in some way before. So can Zionists. The Nazis made conditions for Jews so terrible as soon as they took power that they hoped that Jews would voluntarily leave Germany. Is that really so different from the policy that Zionists are applying by making conditions for Palestinians so terrible that they will voluntarily leave those areas of Palestine which is actually everything, under Zionist control? Yes, Israeli policy is often exactly like that of Nazis. And this definition is completely moronic, and it should be treated as such. And the last part of the definition, or examples, holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the State of Israel. During Operation Cast Lead, the statistics that I read indicated that 80% of Jews supported criminal and genocidal action of the State of Israel. Why shouldn't we hold the American Jewish community collectively responsible for the actions of the State of Israel? It has disproportionate influence in our politics. It basically buys our political leaders so that they keep quiet when the State of Israel commits crimes against humanity and other international crimes. If German Americans had supported Nazi Germany during World War II at 80%, pro-Germany rates, we would have held them collectively responsible for the actions of the State of Israel, the State of Germany, for the Nazi or for Nazi Germany. It might have been incorrect or somewhat questionable, but it's a natural reaction. And we have to start thinking of Israel as a completely criminal state that must be abolished. And every Zionist under U.S. jurisdiction is a criminal under the Proxmire Act, whose lead Senate sponsor was Joe Biden, and which enables the definition of genocide, which enables the International Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide in U.S. law. This statute is 18 U.S.C. 1091. Every Zionist under U.S. jurisdiction should be arrested and should be tried in federal district court under this statute. This statute defines a capital crime. In other words, every Zionist under U.S. jurisdiction should be tried in U.S. district court for his life because he is committing a capital crime under US law. Why is not the US enforcing its national criminal code? That will be a topic in the future. Thanks.